Okay, so biologic or infectious agents can cause cell injury. So we've seen this with bacteria, where bacteria can invade an area such as the lung and lead to pneumonia, and uh, viruses can harm cells such as the HIV virus, harming the T helper cell, which is part of the immune system, or basically any other virus, because viruses need to get into cells to produce more viruses. So they destroy cells, right? Uh, and viruses can also lead to cancer, whether it's the HPV virus causing cervical cancer, uh, or the hepatitis B or hepatitis C virus causing liver cancer. They harm cells because viruses need to get into cells to function. Parasites cause cellular injury, right? So uh, gastrointestinal parasites such as giardiasis or amoebiasis get into the intestinal tract and destroy the cell lining or the mucosal lining of the gastrointestinal tract, and they cause malabsorption. That's why you have diarrhea with these parasites, right? Because they stop food from being absorbed. They are harming the bowel wall lining and leading to diarrhea. So I won't spend too much on number 6 here, but nutritional uh, status can cause cellular injury. So excessive nutrition can lead to other conditions, right? Such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and all of those processes can then harm cells, right? So obesity is very hard on your joints. It's hard on your your heart, because your heart is having to pump much more to many more cells around the body, right? And obesity leads to hypertension, which again puts more of a stress on your heart, because the heart has to pump against higher pressures to get the blood into the systemic circulation. And type 2 diabetes, very damaging to cells, right? And one of the most common causes of type 2 diabetes is overweight, obesity. Nutritional deficiency, so lack of oxygen, lack of vitamins to cells, lead to cellular atrophy and cellular death. That one I think is likely even more clear about how poor nutrition will lead to poor cellular metabolism and cell injury. Okay, so let's talk about number 7. I know I've gone over the 2 hours and 30 minutes. Very hard to predict sometimes. So genetics leading to cellular injury. So the genetics is the process of inheriting conditions from your parents, right? So, and there's many different types of genetic disorders, and we'll talk about some of these in the genetics module. But let's just use some examples of how they can cause cellular injury. So, for example, and this is inherited from your parents, there are a group of disorders where you don't make certain enzymes in the body. And if you don't make certain enzymes, you can't break down certain parts of food that you're consuming. And an example of this is PKU, phenylketonuria. Okay, this is what we call an inborn error of metabolism. So it's a genetic disease that you acquired from your parents, and they may not have had it. They may have just been a carrier of this genetic disease, meaning they carry the defect on one of their chromosomes, but they don't actually have the disease. And what happens with this? Well, you lack the enzyme to break down an amino acid called phenylalanine. Well, you might think that's a pretty small issue. I can't break down this one amino acid. Well, it's a big issue because now you build up tremendous amounts of phenylalanine, and it causes all kinds of problems in the body and in the infant. Okay, and that is why PKU happens to be one of a screening test that's done before a newborn leaves the hospital. Okay, so what does a newborn get checked for before being discharged from a hospital or just after birth? If it's a home birth, they get checked for PKU. Why? Because it can be easily treated by avoiding amino acids that are high in phenylalanine, or avoiding proteins that are very high in phenylalanine. Otherwise, if it's not diagnosed, a lot of brain damage can occur. Okay, so PKU is always screened in infants. It's just a blood test. The other test that's screened in infants, thyroid. So we get a particular thyroid test that you'll learn about later called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And again, just a blood test. Why do we get a thyroid test? Because a child that's born with a thyroid deficiency, if it's not diagnosed, will have mental retardation, a lot of other symptoms, and cognitive delay because they're lacking thyroid hormone. And it's a very easy fix by just providing them with thyroid hormone that we make synthetically. Okay, so TSH and PKU are checked before discharge from hospital. So there's one example, PKU, of a deficiency of one enzyme causing cellular injury. What's another one? Sickle cell disease. So that's just a simple mutation in one gene, and that gene on a chromosome is responsible for the shape of your red blood cells. Well, so one little gene is altered and now my red blood cells have a different shape. Well, that's inherited from your parents, and it's a huge problem if you have sickle cell disease, because your red blood cells don't have a normal shape, and they sickle. They don't have this nice round shape anymore, so they can't go through capillaries very easily, and they get damaged very easily because they don't have a nice round shape to them. So they break down very easily, leading to anemia. They don't go through capillaries of organs very easily, so they block up capillaries. That will lead to hypoxia of the tissue. Okay, so these are just examples of genetic disorders leading to cellular injury. We're going to talk much more about sickle cell disease in another module. Okay, so let's talk about cell death. And we've spoken quite a bit about this already when we were talking about hypoxia that's causing ischemia to cells and to tissue. And then finally, if the lack of oxygen continues, infarction, which is cell death. Okay, so let's talk about it a bit more. So there's programmed cell death, where the body just wants to clear out old cells, and that's called apoptosis. Very normal process, right? So it's the body's way of getting rid of old cells that can be replaced with newer cells, because cells wear out as well, okay? So it's not from injury, it's just from cellular programming. So it's built into the cell, say in the DNA of the cell, that at some point it's going to undergo apoptosis and get removed from the body as waste. So there's no inflammation, just a normal body process. Versus necrosis. Necrosis is basically the same as infarction. It's cell death by some kind of an injury. Okay? So when, say for example, a group of cells, say in the heart, lack oxygen because the artery is blocked that was feeding them, and the pumps fail in the cell membrane, and the fluid leaks in, and they die, that's necrosis. So that's cellular necrosis, or myocardial necrosis, or we can call it myocardial infarction. And there's definitely inflammation when cells die from an injury. Okay? So very different processes. Apoptosis is a natural cellular death. Necrosis is from some kind of an injury to the tissue, whether it's a hypoxic injury or a direct impact crush injury or UV damage injury. Necrosis is always from some kind of damage, and it results in inflammation in the body. Okay, so here's an image of apoptosis, or what we call programmed cell death, right? So damaged, worn out cells need to be cleared on a regular basis. This is happening millions of times every day in a human body. And the enzymes are activated within the cell and destroy their own cell, and they auto-digest the cell proteins, the DNA, and by the way, all those things can be reused. Proteins break down to amino acids, DNA breaks down to nucleic acids. The body's going to use it again, right? So even though it's destroyed a cell, it's going to reuse some of the material. Okay? And finally, at the end of this cellular destruction, you're going to have macrophages, which are part of the immune system, that are going to engulf or phagocytose these cells and auto-digest the cell. Okay? No inflammation. This is a normal process. Okay, so here's a slide just comparing apoptosis to necrosis. Remember, necrosis is always from some kind of an injury. We spent a lot of time talking about hypoxic injury to a cell. And the main reason we spent so much time talking about that is hypoxic injury is really the beginning of the discussion of blocked arteries to different parts of the body, such as a blocked artery to the brain leading to a stroke, which is necrosis of cerebral tissue. Blocked artery to the heart, which will be cell death and necrosis of myocardial tissue. Blocked artery to a leg can lead to cell death and muscle death and necrosis or infarction of the leg. Okay, so always an abnormal process. Okay, and what happens to the cells? Well, they swell in necrosis because the sodium-potassium pump starts functioning or stops functioning, and water pours into the cells, and the cells die. Okay, there's always inflammation associated with necrosis because it's an abnormal process. The cell died because of some kind of an injury, and typically the one of the main injuries is that the plasma membrane of the cell has been disrupted, whether it's from a direct impact or a crush injury or a hypoxic injury that's led to reduced ATP. The plasma membrane has been disrupted, and now the contents of the cell are going to pour into the bloodstream. And that is partly how we can tell that someone's had a heart attack. When we do blood tests, we're actually looking for particular enzymes that have leaked out of the cells and into the bloodstream. And by far the most common one that we check for in a heart attack is an enzyme called troponin, which is specific to myocardial cells. Okay, that's just an aside because you'll be hearing about this later, but just know that necrosis is the same as infarction, is the same as cell death, abnormal cell death. Apoptosis, typically it's a physiological process, right? It's typically normal. It typically affects one cell at a time. It's not because an artery got blocked, for example. The cell gradually shrinks in size. There's really no inflammation, and the body reuses the contents of the cell. It'll break down the proteins, the DNA, and other parts of the cell and recycle them to produce new cells. Okay, so what are the outcomes of a cellular injury? Whether we're talking about hypoxia from a blocked artery, or direct impact from a car accident, or UV radiation from having fallen asleep outside in the sun, what can happen to a cell? Well, the first one is that it's a reversible injury, and the cell can recover and lead or return to normal function. And that would be an example of, say, ischemia. So somebody has a blocked artery in their coronary artery that feeds their heart, but there was enough time to get it open, say with a drug or with a mechanical device or a stent, to open the artery, and the cell survives, right? So it didn't die. So reversible injury would be something like ischemia. Apoptosis, well, that's an outcome of a cell, because in the end all cells die and other ones get produced from mitosis, right? So that's programmed cell death. And lastly, cell death and necrosis. So say we couldn't get that artery open fast enough in the heart, and some cells died or infarcted, and another term for it is necrosis, cellular death, right? And with cellular death is where the cells release its contents into the bloodstream. Okay, we're almost done here. Just gonna do some terms and definitions. So what's an aneurysm? An aneurysm is basically a dilatation and enlargement of an artery. And it's typically caused from some kind of a weakness in the arterial wall. And they can burst, right? They can rupture, leading to a hemorrhage. So if it's a cerebral aneurysm, it can lead to a hemorrhage in the brain. If it's an abdominal aortic aneurysm, it can lead to a massive hemorrhage into the abdomen. Angiogenesis, just a term for new blood vessel formation, and we use that term when we were talking about cancer, because cancer cells need blood just like all cells, and they can stimulate angiogenesis. Atherogenesis or atherosclerosis is the formation of fatty plaques in the arteries, and we'll talk about that more and how fatty plaques develop in arteries. And it's typically from our diet. It's also partly from other damaging effects to the arteries that, such as high cholesterol, high lipids, that then lead to plaque formation in arteries that can then lead to blockage of arteries. Okay. The term etiology, that just means where did the disease originate from? What's the etiology of a disease? Okay. Gangrene just refers to death of a tissue, often from either reduced blood flow plus infection has occurred because the tissue has died, and dead tissue is a perfect place for infection to begin. What's histology? That's just the study of cells and tissues and organs, typically by using a microscope with staining of the cells. What's infarction? I think you know this by now. Infarction is typically death or cellular death, typically from a blocked artery leading to obstruction of blood supply. That's the most common way that we can get an infarction, such as a heart attack or a stroke, right? So blocked blood supply to an organ. Ischemia is a reduction in blood supply to tissues or an organ, causing a reduction in oxygen that's needed for cellular metabolism, but the cell hasn't died yet, okay? Or the tissue hasn't died yet. And that is the time where we rush to try and open an artery in the heart, open an artery that's blocked in the leg or in the brain to try and stop ischemia from turning into infarction. Okay, so a couple of quick questions here and we're done this module. I know, half an hour overtime, I apologize. Okay, so what term describes cancer of the epithelial pigment cells? So the pigmented cells of the epithelium are melanocytes, so it would be a melanoma, okay? Leukemia is cancer of the white blood cells. A carcinoma is a cancer of epithelial cells in general, right? So what are epithelial cells? The skin cells, the gastrointestinal cells from the mouth to the anus, the epithelial cells of the respiratory tract. Those are all epithelial cells. Basically any cells that also surround organs can be epithelial cancers as well. Okay, so this next question, what defines an oncogene? So we spoke about oncoviruses, so viruses that can lead to cancer. So onco is the term for oncology, which is the study of cancer. So an oncogene is a gene producing cancer, right? So it's a mutated gene in cells that is now causing cancer. And what caused the gene to mutate? Well, all kinds of cellular injuries, whether it was UV radiation, free radicals, some kind of harm to the DNA, potentially from drugs, chemicals, anything like that. So the answer is A, a mutated gene that causes cancer. B, an underactive gene that allows cell proliferation? No. A cell that controls and inhibits cell growth? No. A cell that resembles the surrounding tissue? No. Okay, a mutated gene that causes cancer is the answer. Okay, so that's it for this module. Again, I apologize for going over by 30 minutes. It's very hard to predict exactly 2 hours and 30 minutes when the module begins, but I'll try to keep to that, okay? So next week we're going to have a whole new module on the inflammation of the body, and then we're going to discuss the immune system of the body. So really interesting topics. I hope the voiceovers are providing you with lots of information and things to think about. And I think the PowerPoints combined with the voiceover, combined with the chapter that they refer to in your textbook, will be very complementary to helping you understand pathophysiology.